Hello. Welcome once again to our continued discussion and reading of the Great Secrets of Israel, discoveries among the Bantus of Africa, and the sacred meaning of the Song of Solomon, translated according to the African Palaver by the beloved Pastor Thomas Vanda Odimba. This presentation is brought to you by Operation Isaiah 58 Biblical Literacy Institute, where we are reading critically as a righteous act. This is a part of our Identity Empowerment Project, the Restorative Justice Identity Empowerment Project, discussion number 16. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Before we get started into the actual reading and discussion, I would like to preface this conversation by showing why we do what we do here at the Biblical Literacy Institute and why we say reading critically is a righteous act. And that to show and to prove that the scientific method is used in the Bible. Professor John Lennox, a mathematics professor, he defined science as being a method of discovering truth based on observation, the taking of evidence, and comparing notes, evidence that can be shared publicly and generally. And in the Bible, it says to prove all things and to hold fast to that which is good or that which is true. And that's in 1 Thessalonians 5:21. And also in Romans 12:2, it says, and be not conformed to this world, this Greco-Roman Western civilization, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind, that ye may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. And so we understand that this word prove means that you are going to get evidence. You are going to get evidence to find the truth. Now, why are we reading The Great Secrets of Israel, Discoveries Among the Bantus of Africa? Well, from the perspective of status quo historians, Africa was illuminated by the good news or the gospel via the Greco-Roman Western world. And this inherent view suggests a considerable dependence of Bantu Africans and Bantu Africans of the diaspora, as well as all of humanity, on the West interpretation of the Hebrew biblical text. Biblical interpretive power by specifically Bantu Africans and Bantu Africans of the diaspora has been undermined under the insistence by the Western Academy that their readings are universally valid, whereas their interpretations are in fact a product of Western capitalist assumptions in their pursuit of happiness as it relates to individualism as an economic philosophy. And this is widely known if you go into these readings, Power and Privilege, and these Fable of the Bees, by Bernard Vanderville and Adam Smith's The Wealth of the Nation. This evidence is the evidence that supports that everybody knows. It's widely known. This is not conjecture. It's not opinion. You know, it's widely published and known that the interpretations of the Bible are based on capitalist assumptions. Now, also, we now understand that the significance of interpretation must be done within a specific context as that which analyzes the biblical text from the perspective of a de-Hellenized worldview and culture. So we now understand this. A lot of us, me included, did not understand this growing up in the church, didn't understand about reading works and reading books in context. And so, you know, due to the anti-literacy laws, you know, which all of us are who are descendants of the transit of slaves, of the enslaved, are part of our legacy is that the tradition or the anti-literacy laws, the legacy that was passed on to us and to our children and our children's children, the effects and the impact of the anti-literacy laws. But some of us, you know, have, you know, been able to get to an understanding now to come to this point in our evolution where we understand now that interpretation must be done within a specific context. And so this is a premeditated epistemological critique and reread of the scripture with the aim of not only understanding the Bible and God and the Bantu African and Bantu Africans of the diaspora experience and culture, but also to break the hermeneutical hegemony and ideological stranglehold that Eurocentric biblical scholars or biblical exegetes have long enjoyed. Now, some of you might remember when Pastor Odimba talked about how the Bible and the sacred texts were translated according to the culture of others. And I just wanted to go into that a little bit about when Pastor Odimba stated that on page 9, when he states this. After cunningly conquering Egypt and Judea, the Romans and the Greeks undertook to rewrite the history of the Egyptians and the Hebrews and give their own interpretations to the text and the culture of their adversaries in order to assert their superiority over their subjects and the rest of the world. And so we want to hone in on this language here, their own interpretations. All right. It is obvious, Pastor Odimba goes on to state that it is obvious that having rewritten their history, the Greeks and the Romans forgot, deleted, or overlooked some important parts of their history of their adversaries, and this brought about differences in interpretation, slips, and confusion as to what some people consider as more sacred. But here it is, translated according to the culture of others. An obvious case of wanton immorality, as stated by Hermes. So let's look at this translation into the according to the culture of others. And we talked about this. We'd had this discussion in the last video, and I was really meditating about this information here that we found online. And when it talks about the Anglo-Saxons, and it was so curious to me that when it states that their history is a history of cultural identity, and because this series is a series about identity empowerment, and I just really was just I've been fascinated by this information that the history of the Anglo-Saxons, according to their documents, is a history of cultural identity, and it developed from divergent groups in association with the people's adoption of Christianity and was integral to the founding of various kingdoms. The elite declared themselves kings who developed birds and identified their roles and peoples in biblical terms. And I was thinking and meditating on this, and I was like, Lord, what did this look like in real time? I mean, this is, basically a general statement, but I was really pondering, trying to figure out how did this look? How did it look? How does this statement here, the history of the Anglo-Saxons, is the history of cultural identity and how they identified their roles in peoples? I wanted to know more detail about what this looked like in real time and how it was that these people what are referred to as the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, the descendants or the English ancestors, families, wealthy families in the United States, long established wealthy families, mostly English ancestors, how they became this family-based political, financial, and cultural power. And as I was meditating, and looking and just thinking and just asking the Most High to just direct me, and just this question, I wanted to know, what does it look? How did that look? And do you know? It wasn't even 5 minutes. I want to say 5 or 7 minutes that I was looking on the internet, and I found this article, this paper. And literally my body, when I read the abstract, I had a physical reaction because it was exactly the answer to my question. And the title of the paper is called The Anglo-Saxons as God's Chosen People. It's online. You can go online. I recommend everybody go online and get it. It's a PDF. And this is the author, Miss Deborah Hellinga. She did her bachelor's thesis on it in 2018. And I'm not going to go over the whole paper. It was about 18 pages, well, 20 altogether, with including she's got all her references, works cited, all of it is there, primary and secondary references. And I just want to go over a few of the things that she says, just to like back up this cultural identity and the power it yields when you have a cultural identity. And let's just read. So she states here that this thesis will examine the vernacular works by King Alfred and Elfric in a wider historical context to reveal how the Old English vernacular and the connection to the Old Testament Israelites aided in the creation of an identity for the English people and the legitimizing of England. And when I read this, I told you, when I read this first part, my body I had a physical reaction to this when I read this. That she said that this is what she's going to talk about. I don't know if some may have already been made aware of this information, but I never have been aware of this information. I'm, like I said, I'm a child of the former enslaved and, illiterate. And so, I'm this is all new for me. And so, but yeah, it's that the English people, because of the connection with the Old Testament Israelites, it aided in the creation of an identity for the English people and the legitimizing of England. Now, she goes on to state this: isolated from the cultural and religious center at the continent, Britannia was left by the Romans as a scattered multicultural island. Gildas and Bede related the Anglo-Saxons' hardships and journeys to those of the Old Testament Israelites. Formulating this relationship, the idea of the Anglo-Saxons as the new chosen people was constructed and would present a new way of legitimizing their new nation, England, as it arose. Through the Gregorian mission, the Anglo-Saxons were introduced to the Roman Christian faith. This reestablished the link to the old Roman Empire, created the possibility of new relationships with the continent for the Anglo-Saxons. In the 10th century, the Heptarchy became one unified English kingdom, basing themselves upon older writings and the authority of being the new chosen people. The vernacular was used by King Alfred to educate the laity and by Elfric to craft elaborate manuscripts. Now, she's going to go into, I'm not going to read the whole paper, but she's going to go into all this in her paper, that they are basing themselves upon older writings. And so this is something that, we need to make ourselves aware of, is that the Bible is an ancient source. It's an authoritative work. And here we're going to find out, as we begin to do our due diligence and proving and finding evidence, we're going to find out more about how the Bible gave them the authority to do and the confidence to go forth. Now, she states here, in the tongue of the people, the dialect of the people, the vernacular. Before England became one unified kingdom, it was an island consisting of several small kingdoms. 7 of those kingdoms, excluding what is now known as Scotland and Ireland, formed the so-called Heptarchy. The Heptarchy's kingdoms were simultaneously vastly different from one another and similar in their isolation from the continent due to their position on the island. Medieval Europe was an ever-changing place after the fall of the Roman Empire due to the continuous influx of new people. Though the empire was no more, the individual houses began to found their own kingdoms. The papacy in Rome still echoed the power of the Roman Empire, exercised influence through Christianity. And again, whenever we know that word Christianity is being used, Christianization, Christendom, basically, in a nutshell, they're saying that they were reading the Hebrew Israelite Bible or scriptures or canon. That's what they were engaged. That's what they were engaging in, interpreting the sacred text of the Hebrew Israelites. That's what that means when you see Christianity. Now, in by analysis. Now, in the tongue of the people, she goes on to state, Miss Deborah Hellinga states that Pope Gregory the Great set out to bring the gospel, okay, question mark, to the Heptarchy under the Catholic Benedictine monk Augustine in what was later called the Gregorian mission. Though Christians were already present in the Heptarchy through the influence of the Franks, the Gregorian mission brought the Heptarchy back in touch with Rome. This renewed relationship promised new possibilities for the Anglo-Saxons as they were now connected with a continent where the political and religious center was located. It goes on to read, Miss Deborah Hellinga brings our attention to the fact that the Franks had already brought Christianity to the Heptarchy under the Merovingian dynasty. The presence of their Christianity can be seen in the 6th century monk Gildas de Excidio et Conquestu Britanniae and the 7th century monk Bede's Historia Ecclesiastica Gentis Anglorum. I think this means the history of the church, the English Gentile church. When Gildas looked at the Israelites of the Old Testament, he interpreted, okay, many of the hardships and the journeys of the Old Testament Israelites as similar to the struggles his own people were going through. So here we have the interpretation of sacred texts according to the culture of others, as Pastor Odimba was speaking of, making note of. This is what it looked like in real time. That Gildas looked at the Israelites of the Old Testament and he interpreted many of the hardships and journeys of the Old Testament Israelites as similar to the struggles his own people were going through. For instance, Gildas saw the similarity between the Assyrian attack on the Israelites in the Old Testament and his own people being attacked by the Anglo-Saxons. Reflecting on this, a new relationship was formulated between the Heptarchy and the Old Testament Israelites. This eventually resulted in a genealogy for the Anglo-Saxon kings, which traced back to Noah, making the Anglo-Saxons related to the Old Testament Israelites. See that? Isn't that interesting? So here it is, that interpreting the text according to the culture of others. And Miss Deborah goes on to state this in the tongue of the people. This is known as the origin myth and sufficed as explanation to the Anglo-Saxons for their hardships and cultural changes. This new constructed relationship was the foundation for the Anglo-Saxons as the new chosen people of God. The idea of being God's chosen people was not uncommon. Israel was God's chosen nation, and the Christians were God's people through the salvation of Christ. The Anglo-Saxons recognized themselves as the new chosen people due to the similarities with the Old Testament Israelites. And she should have wrote here, due to their perceived similarities with the Old Testament Israelites. Due to their perceived similarity. Because actually, as I was reading this, and he was saying that it was similar with the Assyrian attack on the Israelites. Well, those of us have been following discussions, we realize that the attacks that were being perpetrated and have been being perpetrated on the Israelites were Hamites. It's the Hamitic group, the Hamites. They're always attacking the Semites. So here you have a Hamitic, morphologically Hamitic group, Assyrians attacking the Semitics, right? They're from a different lineage. And here, they're being attacked by their own people. So that's the main difference that I see. But according to him, he said it was a similarity. So that's why, maybe she should have said that due to the perceived similarities with the Old Testament Israelites, and found explanations in the Old Testament of the Bible for the events of their history and their present day. It goes on to read, kings and queens played an important role in the forming of a nation and the role of the vernacular. It was under King Ethelstan and that the Heptarchy became one unified English kingdom in the 10th century. Their origin myth offered a new way of legitimizing their new kingdom as they built upon the older writings and the authority of the new chosen people. There's authority here. We're looking at the legitimizing and having authority. And several of these writings were commissioned by Ethelstan's grandfather, King Alfred, and King Alfred the Great. King Alfred, while keeping his focus on defending his country against the Vikings, gathered knowledge and manuscripts and aimed his attention to the education of the laity, the ordinary people, neither clergy nor nobility. What is even more remarkable, states Miss Deborah Hellinga, what is even more remarkable is that King Alfred did not want the laity to be educated in Latin, but rather in the vernacular, the language spoken by the ordinary people, nowadays known as Old English. King Alfred commissioned works, educated his people, and through the usage of the vernacular, raised Old English in prestige. Where most of Europe wrote its official and religious manuscripts in Latin, England was the first to write and document in its vernacular. Now, she goes on to state this in the tongue of the people. After King Alfric of Eynsham, an English abbot, continued the crafting of religious texts, such as poems and Bible passages, educational texts for his students, and many other important works for the English people. So here you see them crafting religious texts, the Bible, here they go with their craftiness, right? Interpreting Bible passages according to, as Pastor Odimba said, according to the code. This is what it looked like in real time. And then educating their people, their students, calling them educational texts. Remaining in touch with the Benedictines, the largest monastic order in medieval Europe, Alfred wrote in his vernacular in order to continue educating the laity, which King Alfred had begun. Advancing under the authority of the new chosen people and guided by the older writings, England legitimized itself as a nation and constructed its identity. All right, so I just wanted to bring that information in to, and like I said, that paper is available online, and if you want to read the full thesis, her full paper, it's very, very interesting. She goes into more detail about the process and what it actually, how the Bible became the soul of Western civilization, and what that the process and how that the process looked. So I also wanted to go into this recap of Pastor Odimba when he talked about the sedentary Jews and that the Jews have never been nomads, and how he was saying that the Israelites had farms and a family tomb, and these characteristics could not be attributed to a nomad. And the word means to agitate, to tremble, to wander, to roam, to cause to wander, to stagger, vagabond, run. And these, he says, are neither the part of the character of the Jews nor of Abraham, right? Now, he said, Abraham, in any case, Abraham was an ancestor of the Israelites and not an Israelite. So he goes into detail, giving us evidence, proving that the Jews were never nomadic. When he states that if we can't believe these details about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob not being nomads, it is, however, important to note that Joseph was no more a nomad, and that the Israelites, during their days of slavery, could no more be nomads. If all these facts are not convincing, Pastor Odimba states, we can at least agree that David, Solomon, the Levites, and Jesus were not nomads. To have mobilized a flock of 700 camels and servants, the Queen of Sheba could also not have been a nomad. It is also important to not to confuse the kingdom of Seba with that of Saba. The former was made of Ethiopians, and the later located at the north of Arabia, made up of Philistines, Hamites, who invaded Ethiopia during the 10th century. As part of the kingdom, it could not have been nomadic. Thus, the Jews could not have been nomads in Africa. So I went into we talked about he wanted to make that clear, a point about that Jews not being nomadic, and I found this information interesting going into you know the Anglo-Saxons, declaring themselves as the new chosen people of God and making a connection with the Old Testament Israelites. And when I came upon this information, when it's talking about the Germanic peoples, right? And so when we look at this group, the Germanic peoples, it's a tribe, and these people are also called the Teutonic, Swabian, or Gothic in older literature, are an ethno-linguistic Indo-European group of Northern European origin, and they are identified by their use of Germanic languages, which diversified out of the Proto-Germanic during the pre-Roman Iron Age. And as a linguistic group, modern Germanic peoples include Afrikaners, and those are the white people that set up the apartheid system in South Africa, who the Afrikaners, the Austrians, Danes, the Dutch, and the English, the Anglo-Saxons, Flemish, Frisians, Germans, Icelanders, Lowlands, Scots, Norwegians, Swedes, and others, including diaspora populations such as some groups of European Americans. All right. So these are your Germanic, they're called Germanic peoples. Now, in their documentation, they say that the Germanic tribes are an ancient nomadic civilization. So right there, I understood why Pastor Odimba wanted to make that clear about the Jews, that they have never been a nomadic group of people. All right. They have never been nomads in Africa. They've never been nomads. But the Germanic tribes are described in their documents as being an ancient nomadic civilization that used their superior military strength to lay the foundation for modern Europe. So that's why I wanted to bring that information out as well and share that with you, all those who are interested. Now, we want to continue going into, remembering what this discussion is about, that, we're looking into what Pastor Odimba states is the Jewish origins of African American slaves. And that, the 10 tribes that were so long thought lost, and the Jewish origins of the African American slaves, and they are Bantus from Africa. And according to prophecy, they will return to Israel before the coming of the Messiah, according to prophecy. And I'm going to, in the next discussion, we're going to go into these prophecies and even you can do your own research to find out how many prophecies that the Israelite prophets prophesied that are documented in secular history. So we might want to pay attention to the prophecies that the Bible, the Israelite prophets prophesy. So according to the prophecy, that's what it states. Now we want to just recap that this is what's being stated by Pastor Odimba, that according to various legends of the Jewish tribes of Africa, the latter believe they belong to a dynasty, which is a line of hereditary rulers, which can only be that of the family of Joseph, which according to them is the basis for the formation of all the Bantu tribes of Africa from the time of Joseph to the fall of Jerusalem in the year 70 AD. So all the Bantu tribes, all of them, according to the legends of Jewish tribes in Africa, they're saying that the line of Joseph, the family of Joseph, according to them, is the basis of the formation of all Bantu tribes of Africa from the time of Joseph. Now, so here, Pastor Odimba states this, that, from the time of its formation in Egypt, and I just want to bring this information in so we can always, just kind of review and remember why this information is being brought forth and the audience and who it's directed towards. That From the time of its formation in Egypt during the era of the 12 children of Jacob, Israel was made up of the people divided into two groups and two distinct territories in this great host country. The other children of Jacob were separated from their brother Joseph. This was discernible when Jacob told Joseph in the book of Genesis 48, verses 5 through 6, quote, "Therefore your two sons who were born to you in the land of Egypt before I came to you in Egypt are now mine. Ephraim and Manasseh shall be mine, just as Reuben and Simon are. As for the offspring born to you after them, they shall be yours, but they shall be recorded under the names of their brothers with regard to their inheritance." And I like this word inheritance. No one is speaking about Section 8 and food stamps and civil rights and voting, none of that. I'm claiming my inheritance. This is about inheritance. And in fact, I should have, maybe I'll bring it in the next slide, but Miss Deborah Hellinga, she talks about in her paper how that what this whole thing was about with them converting to Christianity and claiming themselves as the new chosen people was that it meant that they could now claim the inheritance. Yes, she said here, I'm going to read it. She said that however important the Old Testament Israelites and mostly their stories in the Bible were deemed to be, the Christians were the new people of God through Christ. This meant that the Christians could claim the bold inheritance of the formerly chosen people, So that's what it, in a nutshell, she's saying that this is what it all meant, and then what it all comes down to what it all came down to, according to her research, was that they wanted to claim the inheritance. So here he's talking about Jacob. Israel is saying that they shall be recorded under the names of their brothers with regard to the inheritance. Now, Pastor Odimba states that the lack of attention to this verse makes the Hebrew nation lose the most important part of its history and its people that remained in Egypt and Joseph. In fact, Israel drew a clear distinction between him and Joseph, but he gave the name Israel to both groups. He specified that on the promised land, the descendants of Joseph would be called by the name of their two brothers, Ephraim and Manasseh. Without this specification, Joseph and his other children would have formed a third tribe of Israel or would have simply become a lost people. Now, he goes on to state, Pastor Odimba goes on to state that Joseph and his other children, apart from Ephraim and Manasseh, quote, although Joseph was part of Israel, or Jacob, Israel spoke about him as follows in Genesis chapter 49, verse 22. Quote, Joseph is a fruitful bow by a spring. His branches run over the wall, end quote. This means that the people will not live on the promised land with the children of Jacob, but will constitute a nation of Israel in Africa. A nation of Israel in Egypt or Africa, also known as Africa. A nation of Israel in Africa. In the first place, this prophecy of Jacob took account of the title of Pharaoh that Joseph bore in Egypt, and secondly, the property that the latter had acquired. And Joseph had acquired the whole of Egypt in the Bible. And the Bible explains this in Genesis chapter 47, verse 20. So Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh. All the Egyptians sold their fields because their famine was severe upon them, and the land became Joseph's, end quote. So Joseph and Jacob could not have abandoned, this is what Pastor Odimba states, that Joseph and Jacob could not have abandoned such a great heritage that they had acquired in Egypt. The Bible says that he also became a great Pharaoh, and by virtue of this, his descendants had a right to the throne of Egypt through their father and to the throne of the clergy of Egypt through their mother, who was the daughter of the high priest of On, end quote. All right, so I just wanted to, this is what it's all about, right? the Bantu children of Israel, and the tracing the lineage and the history, the cultural identity and personality of a people, the African peoplehood, all right, the historical truth, and cultural identity. And that's why we named this series Identity Empowerment, cultural identity. And hopefully this information that's being shared is you know helping to bring an understanding of identity and cultural identity, and being a part of the whole awakening that is taking place, the Great Awakening, even that's taking place worldwide. Now, the African Palaver, a literary genre, is we're gonna get into this part of the book, the last part of the book. Now, Pastor Odimba states that, however, to avoid any possibility of falsification of their adversaries, the Jews used coded language for certain strategic and sensitive texts so that their adversaries could not understand them, although they could hear and read them. The most important text that needed to be hidden was about the link between the Jews and their offsprings of Egypt that they had immortalized and kept in the Song of Songs. So here is what this is all about. Pastor Odimba is saying is the link between the Jews and their offsprings of Egypt. That's what they immortalized and kept in the song. And that's what the translation is going to reveal. Now, this coded language, he's referring to is figurative language. There's a lot of figurative language in the Bible that the authors used, coded language. And if we're not up on figures of speech, then some of the information is going to be hard to accurately understand and interpret. But one of the books that uses heavily this coded language is the African Palaver, which is a literary genre. And so and then he says that any discourse on the history of the Jews must take into account the three factors, namely prophecy, culture, and history, because the Jews are first and foremost a prophecy-governed people before becoming a historical and cultural people. All the activities of this people over the years were predicted several years in advance by their prophets, and for this reason, only the Bible can respond to the questions we cannot answer. So let's start and begin the read. Section 2, Chapter 1, the Song of Songs in African Palaver, similarities between these two people in their practice of the palaver and the scene as depicted in the Book of Songs. And this is where we left off in the last video. So on page 77, this was the last slide. These two people have a peculiar way of reiterating their lost brothers, that the themes and the expressions that these two people use during this ceremony that reunites two brothers hitherto lost to each other is exactly that which is depicted in the book of Song of Solomon in the Bible. And it is our belief that the book of Song of Songs could be set in this tradition. Now, we cannot talk about the book of the Song of Songs without identifying Solomon, its author, who was the king of Israel during his era. He ruled Jerusalem from 980 to 938 BC. The story of Solomon is not obscure. It has such landmarks as his journey to Egypt, his marriage to the daughter of Pharaoh, his construction of the temple and of a house for his Egyptian wife, his fabulous wealth, his other wives, and his wisdom, which made his a great king of this era. Pastor Odimba goes on to state that the era of Solomon coincided with a time when the Nubians and the Ethiopians from Upper Egypt, the south, resumed control of Egypt after their victory over those that the Jews referred to as the ungodly people, the descendants of Ham, who had constituted the 20th and the 21st dynasties. Footnote 44. This domination was weakened by the arrival of the Smedes, who was a descendant of Ramses, who abandoned the party of Seti I to join Ammon. Footnote 45, he reconstructed Avaris and the ruins of Pi Ramses by building a new residence. His successors, Sunes, P. Sumnes, soon as completed the construction work. The fifth king of this dynasty was Simon, footnote 46, a contemporary of David, who chased out all the enemies of David. It goes on to read, Pastor Odimba states this, that the observers thought that the wife of Solomon was the daughter of Shanshak I, although there are no traces of relationship between Shanshak and Israel. However, his enthusiastic policy of support for Israel and that of his successors gives the impression that he had a close relationship with Israel. When Egypt was under the rule of the Nubians and Ethiopians, 960 BC, an unconditional alliance was observed between Egypt and Israel. It was also observed that Solomon's business interests extended to all the territories that were under the Egyptians. These things, which 3 centuries earlier were impossible right from the time of the Exodus, even with the other patriarchs who were buried at the Upper Egypt because of the inability of their caravans that could not cross the barrier raised by the enemies of Israel, became possible under Solomon without any conquest whatsoever. It is in this vein that we could believe that Decker, the steward of Solomon in 1 Kings chapter 4, verse 9, by virtue of this name, was the founder of the Dakar harbor in Senegal, considering the fact that a heavy traffic existed between Central America and Egypt through the Malian coast, which was later known as Soyuda or Sudan, the land of Judah, footnote 48. This was the era to which history attributes the construction of the Egyptian pyramids, footnote 49. This fact is justified by the discovery around the pyramids of mummies and sphinxes that represent Bantu people, architecture, and civilization. This demonstrates a link between Solomon and these Nubian and Ethiopians. Okay, it goes on to read in Solomon and the African culture. Let us note that the Jews were one of the ethnic groups of Palestine that entered Upper Egypt because of Joseph. This people had never lost this right under the Semite Egyptians, as the case was under the Hamites during the New Empire. Having spent his youthful days in Egypt, where he married the Pharaoh's daughter, as indicated earlier, it is possible that he gained mastery of the Egyptian culture and philology. This gives us the impression that he was also proficient in the intricacies of African Palaver, this literary medium by which the Egyptians carried out important diplomatic, judicial, social, and other businesses that are replete in the administration of the African political system. It is worthy of note that Israel has never had as good relations with any other country as she had with Egypt during the days of Joseph and Solomon. This shows that there could have been cultural exchanges between the two kingdoms. Many things that cannot be explained in the Western culture are easily explained in African culture. A case in point is that case of Hobab in the Bible, which is confused between the brother-in-law and the father-in-law of Moses. The exegetes try to explain the two positions in the light of the fact that he was the son of Jethro. However, as far as Africans are concerned, the eldest son could easily stand in for the father and be recognized as a father-in-law, given that he is, in that capacity, representing the family of the in-laws of Moses. We have chosen to use this example to illustrate the difficulty that Western culture encounters in the translation of a text that has to do with a people that was embraced in the high circles of the Egyptian culture. Okay, the next section, the Palaver and the Song of Solomon, page 80. We have resorted to the African Palaver with the purpose of comparing the texts, situate the event that constituted a landmark in the writing of the Song of Solomon, define the circumstances and its writing, and discover the overwhelmingly sacred meaning of this book as compared to all the books of the Bible, as the Jewish tradition considers it. This is because it is quite Excuse me. My throat is getting dry. So Pastor Odimba goes on to state that the this is because it is quite controversial that the great king, who is noted for his wisdom, could publicly express love using such mundane terms, and that the elders of Israel could consider this aberrant conduct as so sacred as to include it in the sacred documents of the Jewish canon and elevating it over and above all the other books. If the Jews in the Western world have not been able to secure a good translation of the text, it is most probable that those in Africa have kept the style and the knowledge of this book. That is why the approach of the palaver is very important to facilitate access to the meaning of this mysterious book. Okay, so here's an extract of the palaver from the Bombardas. Pastor Odimba states this: it is proper to present an extract of palaver in order to give our readers an idea of the literacy genre that the Jews and Egyptians commonly used before and after the era of Solomon. For example, we have taken an extract from the scenario of marriage. In Africa, when the members of a clan want to ask the hand of a lady for their son from another clan, they normally find a spokesman that is known in the Congolese society as Nzoni, Mbaku, or Tsibanji. Any person who desires to express his or her opinion during the palaver is expressed using images and symbols. The expressions, proverbs, and gestures must all be related to the theme and the circumstances of the occasion. Someone may say, for instance, quote, "As a hunter, I shot a wild animal. Following the traces of its blood, I finally find myself in your territory. I shall pay whatever you will ask for if you could give me my game." End quote. Translation: I met a lady and proposed to her. She directed me to you, and that is why I have come to fulfill my promise. I am ready to give you any gifts you may ask for. End quote. The family of the lady will respond, "We live close to the forest, and so from time to time, some wild animals come in to live with our domestic ones. My dear brother, according to tradition, what I do not eat, I cannot prevent those who eat from eating it. We, however, hope you are not referring to our domestic animals." End quote. Translation: in our house, there are many women, including our wives and daughters. By tradition, we cannot court or nor marry our own daughters. How then could we prevent those who could marry them to do so? We, however, hope you did not come to take our wives. The lady's family: we shall show you our flock so that you could point out the one you are looking for. We, however, hope you will not mistakenly choose any of our domestic ones. Translation: we shall introduce you to our daughters. We shall introduce our daughters to you so that you can indicate publicly the one you are looking for, hoping that you are not after our wives. So as you can see, this is an extract from the Palaver of the Bambaras, the literary genre of the Palaver. Now, here Pastor Odimba comments, if we were to explain such a text in the Western literature and culture, we would say that it is the story of a poem of a hunter. However, those who know this literary genre would easily tell that it has to do with a marriage ceremony. As Hermes, we would say that although translation is easy and simple, considered from the perspective of the palaver, it has a hidden message. So translation is simple and easy, but interpretation is hidden, right? So the general observation, having established the relation between Egypt or Africa and the Kingdom of Solomon, the migration and the presence of Orthodox Jews in this region of Africa, we have thus justified the influence of the African culture on the Song of Songs of Solomon that we are about to interpret from the perspective of African culture in contemporary times, the African Palaver. Okay, so that's going to conclude this discussion number 16 for today. In the next discussion, we will go into the characters of the book and the certification of the translation of the Songs of Solomon and the actual translation. The translation of the Songs of Solomon in the framework of the Palaver, and it's going to be quite long, pages 85 through 156. All right, so that concludes this discussion and information sharing of information, endeavoring to be to implement and apply the scientific method in defining our world and responding to our reality and analyzing our reality. I will leave you with this final word from King Solomon. How much better is it to get wisdom than gold, and to get understanding rather to be chosen than silver? Peace and blessings to all who love the truth, and ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. Thank you for your time. Happy studying. Love you.